welcome to History on Blast, episode 37, Fly Me to the Moon. On today's episode, we're going to be putting theologian and natural philosopher John Wilkins on blast for some really creative and misguided ideas about how to get to the moon in the 1600s. But first, this month in history. February, as it turns out, is a big month for astronomy, containing not only the birth of astronomer and physicist Galileo Galilei on February 15th, 1564, but also astronomer Nicholas Copernicus on February 19th, 1473. Both of these men were fundamental to our modern understanding of astronomy, with both of them theorizing that the sun and not the earth was the center of the solar system, and with Galileo being the first astronomer to use a telescope.
Hello everybody, this is Trevor, host of the History of Persia. I'm telling the stories of the empires that dominated the Middle East from the fall of the Assyrians until the rise of Islam. I'll cover topics like the 300 Spartans, the origins of endurance racing, the losing side of Alexander the Great's conquests, and at least one evil priest who replaced and impersonated the king. If those stories and the stories and cultures of Greece and Rome's greatest enemies sound interesting to you, come check out the History of Persia, wherever it is you find your favorite podcasts, like this one.
So, let's start with a little background on John Wilkins, shall we? He was born in February of 1614 in Northamptonshire, England. His father, a goldsmith, died while Wilkins was still fairly young, and his mother remarried. Wilkins then went to school in Oxford. He graduated with his BA in 1631 and a master's in 1634. He studied astronomy. He then went on to become a priest of the Church of England in 1638. And in 1644, he became chaplain to Prince Charles Louis, nephew of King Charles I of England. All of this sounds pretty tame, and honestly it was. He joined a group of people who liked to do scientific experiments and discuss natural philosophy, which was very in vogue in the era. He then went on to marry Robina French née Cromwell. Yep, Cromwell. She's the youngest sister of one Oliver Cromwell. You may recognize the name. I like to yell and scream about him, mostly over his sacking of Ireland, which, the Irish people have never forgotten and will never forget. Thanks to his brother-in-law, John Wilkins then becomes the master of Trinity College, Cambridge. Because all of this is taking place while Oliver Cromwell is the Lord Protector of England. The appointment is actually confirmed by Oliver Cromwell's son, Richard Cromwell, who had succeeded him as Lord Protector. Somehow, through all of this, with the restoration of the monarchy occurring, he only lost his position in Cambridge and became the rector of Cranford and the prebendary of York. He was eventually reduced to preacher in 1661. 1662, he became a vicar in London, and he did lose quite a lot to the Great Fire. But that's not why we're here to yell about the strange things that this man has written. No, we're here to discuss his 1684 writing, A Discovery of a New World, or a discourse tending to prove that 'tis probable there may be another habitable world in the moon, with a discourse concerning the probability of a passage thither, unto which is added a discourse concerning a new planet, tending to prove that 'tis probable our earth is one of the planets, in 2 parts. I love the titles of books from that era because it's like nobody ever taught them what a run-on sentence was. And no one, like, they didn't have the idea of our pithy clickbait titles that we have today. So you get things like that, where what would be a thesis statement in a modern essay is just the title. And honestly, I'm here for it. It's exciting. Give me your whole summary as the title. I want to know what I'm reading. It's delightful. So, what is this about? What he's saying is that, so people had just started to look to the stars and think that, hey, maybe we live on a planet? And like that idea had been being tossed around for a while, but, you know, well, if Earth is a planet and we can be on Earth, maybe we can go be on other planets? Which, yeah, that's true and cool and all that, but this is the 1600s. This is the era where we kind of vaguely sort of have guns that you have to pour gunpowder down the barrel of to make them work, let alone coming up with some sort of like rocket fuel type propulsion. But never fear, Wilkins was prepared for this, because he believed, this is where it gets real exciting, folks. He believed, and here's a quote, "I do seriously and upon good grounds affirm it possible to make a flying chariot, in which a man may sit and give such a motion unto it as shall convey him through the air." Which, yeah, no, like, he's more or less describing an airplane or a helicopter or any sort of aerial vehicle, which is cool. The part where he totally loses me is the part where he thought you only needed to get about 20 feet off the ground to break yourself away from the magnetism of the Earth, because that was what was holding us down. Because, you know, nobody had thought up gravity yet. Because Newton was just kind of having the idea at the same time that Wilkins was writing this. He also had some real cool theories that I love about, you know, they didn't know space was a vacuum in that era. They just sort of thought air went on forever. But clearly the air up higher was different in some way. After all, remember, this man is a bishop. And he believed that the higher up you went, the more pure and divine the air was, and that we would have to acclimatize to it, since we are, after all, earthly creatures of sin, and not the angels that natively dwell there. Yep. I love it. It's real fun. So, yeah. That's more or less his thought, was if we could get up high enough, we would no longer be held down by magnetism and we could just fly. You wouldn't even need the chariot after that, other than to go faster. And of course, once we're not walking on the surface of the Earth, we're not going to have to eat anymore because we're expending a lot less energy. I'm pretty sure there's a bunch of astronauts in the International Space Station who can tell you that's not how that works at all. But that's okay. He didn't know. And really, on the whole, his theories for the era and the thought process he was working within make a lot of sense. It's just that things like the vacuum of space and gravity hadn't been discovered yet. So, to give you a scope of sort of how far afield he was, remember we're talking about the 1680s, it takes until 1959 before we manage to get any sort of craft to the moon at all, which was the Soviet Luna 2, which crashed. I mean, they crashed it on purpose, but it did crash. It made it to the moon. It was an unmanned probe. It crashed. The first successful actual controlled soft landing was the 1966 Luna 9. And as we all know, it takes us to July 1969 with Apollo 11 before we actually get humans landing on the moon. Another important thing to note, since I mentioned that he believed you just needed to get 20 feet off the ground to escape the magnetism of the Earth, what you actually need to escape in order to make it all the way to the moon, as we now know, is the gravitational pull of the Earth, which, even by the time you've reached the moon, you haven't actually fully escaped, but the distance at which you would be pulled towards the moon at, infinitesimal amounts, because the moon doesn't actually have a ton of gravity of its own, but that would be about 300,000 kilometers, which is about 85% of the way from the Earth to the moon. So you have to get well outside of the atmosphere before you would, in a sense, start falling up. The thing, though, that I find most interesting about looking through Wilkins' writing is that he himself actually pointed out that he thought that future generations would look back on the scientific writings of his era and be astounded by their ignorance. And it's true. And it's, looking back, we laugh at things like, acclimatizing to the air that angels breathe, and the idea of flying to the moon in an open chariot. But there are so many things that we're just barely starting to discover now that even 10 years ago, we had very similar thoughts about, just seen through a different lens, because our lens isn't the lens of religion as much anymore. It's the lens of, it's a scientific lens, but it's a limited scientific lens where we don't know everything. We don't know a lot. We don't even really collectively know what we don't know, especially when it comes to space and the deep ocean and things like that. And I think, Wilkins recognizing that someday we would look back and think, wow, look at all the things they didn't know that we know now, is extremely wise, and it's something that we should go into modern scientific endeavors with that frame of mind. We should look at a lot of things through that lens of, what is the future going to look back at us and go, wow, I can't believe they believed that. Because I think we'll be surprised about the things that they think that of us. So that got weirdly philosophical at the end, but that's going to just about do it for us for this episode. Sorry it was late. I had some technical issues with my computer, not wanting to actually run my recording software at all. I managed to get that straightened out, so the next episode should be right on schedule. As always, I would like to thank Defy Them All for the use of their song Keeper of Histories for the intro and outro of our program. If you'd like to get in contact with me, you can do that on Twitter, Facebook, email. Just search for History on Blast. You should be able to find it. It's historyonblast@gmail.com. If you've got any episode topics you'd like to hear covered, I'm planning on doing some new styles of episodes, some new branching off in new directions, trying to find new ways to explore history while keeping things interesting. But if there are any particular eras or really anything that you want to make sure I hit, feel free to let me know. I'm always interested in feedback. So, as always, thank you for listening.